From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Our next speaker will be George R. R. Martin, one of the most distinguished and most versatile writers in science fiction and fantasy. I can remember when I first came to Bookworld long ago and started the science fiction and fantasy coverage that we've continued for a long time. And I read very early on a great story called Sand Kings, one of George's earlier stories, never forgotten it. It's just a wonderful thing, and if you haven't read it, you should, as well as his new books. George R. R. Martin he spent a lot of time in Hollywood, worked on The Twilight Zone, other TV series, Beauty and the Beast, and has come back in recent years to writing fiction again to the benefit of all of us. The Washington Post and the National Book Festival then is really honored and proud to present, for your pleasure, and remember there'll be 10 minutes for questions, George R. R. Martin.
Thank you, Michael. And thank all of you for coming. It's a thrill to be here at the National Book Festival. It's the first time for me at this festival. Not the first time for me in Washington or even on the Mall, although it has been a few years. The last time I was here was the spring of 1971. At that time, I was a graduate student in college at Northwestern University, and they had a internship program where you did political reporting on Capitol Hill for a quarter. And I was assigned here in the spring quarter. I was working in the Medill News Service. I looked somewhat different. I was skinny. I had hair down to my ass. To go in and out of the corridors of power in those days, you did have to wear a coat and tie. So I had my mustard yellow pinstripe double-breasted sports jacket, which went very well with my burgundy bell-bottoms and my black silk Apache scarf. Needless to say, when I wandered into the office of Senators Eastland and Talmadge, I was like nothing else that they'd ever seen, sort of the very picture of the young quasi-hippie journalist. Of course, those were extremely different times than we have today. Those were a time of deep division in the country. There was an unpopular war going on, and bodies coming home every day. And when you were down here in the Mall, they were demonstrate. Come to think of it, it's sort of like it is today. I was here in May Day in '71, covering a gigantic anti-war demonstration that was on the Mall, and I still vividly recall that. You know, in science fiction and fantasy, we have a subgenre called alternate worlds, which some of you may be familiar with. It's the whole concept of another world springing up because of some decision that's made. The South wins the Civil War. The Nazis win World War II. For want of a nail, the battle was lost. All sorts of things like that. And I think back on my last time in Washington as an alternate world when I consider my own life. When I came here to Washington in '71, I'd already sold one story. I'd been writing since I was a kid in Bayonne, New Jersey. Initially, I wrote stories for other kids in the projects where I grew up, and I would sell them to them for a nickel, complete with a dramatic reading. They were mostly monster stories, so I would do particularly good werewolf sounds in those days. Later on in high school, I was a comic books fan. I wrote for the comic fanzines, amateur magazines produced on mimeograph machines and on ditto machines and hectographs, these primitive methods of reproductions of the day, and they'd sell them for a quarter through the mail to other high school kids. And I continued to write through college. I took every opportunity I could to get into a creative writing course or even to be allowed to write fiction in courses that weren't devoted to fiction. In fact, the first professional rejection I ever got, and your first rejection is almost as much as important as your first sale, because it's the moment where you first kind of expose yourself and risk the opinion of the professional world. Was actually a course I wrote for Scandinavian history, which I was studying at the time. I convinced the professor to let me write some historical fiction instead of a term paper. And I got an A on the paper, and he submitted it to American Scandinavian Review, which, of course, rejected it, but it was my first rejection slip. So, but I had sold the story to Galaxy, which had been out earlier that year. So that was one story. And I was here in Washington, living up by Thomas Circle and 14th for 3 months while I did my political reporting. And I had another 3 or 4 stories that were out circulating. And it was here in Washington that I got my second official sale to a fantastic magazine. Ted White was the editor. He lived in a suburb of Washington at the time. I think I was paid like $47 for that, which was somewhat more money than it is today, but not a whole lot more money than it is today. It was still a pretty small amount of money, but fortunately I've done a little better since. At the same time, I was trying to get a job in journalism because this was my last semester and I would have my master's degree come June. So I was sending out hundreds of letters to newspapers all over the country, trying to get a job and be the next Woodward and Bernstein, although actually it was before Watergate, so we didn't know about Woodward and Bernstein yet. All of these newspapers somehow resisted the urge to hire me, so I got nothing but thanks for applying, we'll keep your application on file letters in return. But I did get that sale to Amazing Stories, and I think that had a large part with setting my course in life. If it had been the other way around, if I had gotten several job offers and no fiction sales, I do think there might be an alternate world where I would have gone down the other path, and perhaps now I'd be working for the Washington Post, or more likely the Bayonne Times, which is the closest thing I got to being hired. Instead, I wound up returning to Bayonne, New Jersey, which was my hometown that summer, without a job, having to take the same job I took during the summer, which was as a sports writer for the Department of Parks and Recreation in Bayonne, writing up all their baseball and football games at the kiddie leagues that they played during the season. And because there were like 14 games going on all over the city of Bayonne, on the 1st Street fields, the 14th Street fields, the 47th Street fields, going on simultaneously, I couldn't actually attend any of them. So I was the only sports writer who never attended a game. I sat in an office, and people brought in box scores to me, and I wrote them up for the Bayonne Times and the Jersey Journal. And I've been doing this for every summer for like 3 years. But a couple months previously, I told the Department of Parks and Recreation I couldn't do it that summer because, after all, I would be finished school, I would have my degree, and I thought I'd have a real job. So then, when I didn't have a real job, I had to go back to them and say that could I have that like summer job back, like maybe for one more summer, kind of, please? And they graciously allowed me to have it, but they took their revenge by saying, well, we've had some budget cuts, so you'll have to do the job for half the amount of money we paid you the previous summers. So I did the same work for half the money in half the time. But that left me my mornings free. And because of that story that I'd sold, my second sale, the first time might be a fluke, but when you sold 2, hey, you're a real pro. I decided I'd really give this fiction writing thing a chance. And that summer of 1971, I wrote a dozen stories, one after another, every morning before I went to work at the Department of Parks and Recreation, banging them out. I was doing like a story a week. It was probably one of the most prolific periods of my life. Ultimately, all stories sold. They didn't all sell right away. Some of them took half a dozen years to sell, in fact. But a few of them did sell right away, and they sold to some of the biggest markets of the time. Um, to Analog, which gave me a cover story, and also my first Hugo nominations, my nominations for the best new writer in the field. They really opened doors for me. I know there's a lot of aspiring writers probably in this audience. I meet them wherever I go, and they ask sometimes when I do these sessions like this of what advice I have for writers in how to make it. And to my mind, the advice I can give any writer is really embodied in my own experiences. You have to want it, for one thing. You have to persist, as I did. You have to write. You have to produce the materials. Up until that summer, I'd produced a few short stories a year, fitting it around in my other things. But when I decided that summer that I was really going to go for this, I produced a very significant body of work, and I think I got better with every story that I wrote. I mean, that's the best way to improve as a writer, is actually to write. Because the mere exercise of writing, even if the story doesn't sell, even if the story is itself a failure, will hopefully make you better when it comes time to write the next story. And of course, the other thing about my history that I reflect on is that I really wound up, maybe by happenstance, and the fact that no one wanted to hire me to be a journalist, but I did wind up on the right path for me. I suspect I'm much better as a storyteller than I would have been as a journalist. I love making up my own worlds and making up my own people, and in fact, I've been doing it since I was a kid. Those stories that I sold to the other kids in the neighborhood, I've always made up stories. I've been making up stories since I was old enough to write words on a tablet. Somewhere in my papers at Texas A&M University is a small, one of those black and white tablets that kids used in school in those days, where you would take your pen and color in the white parts till they were black and blue. And it's a space encyclopedia that I was preparing when I was like 6 years old. And the letters, there's drawings of fictional planets and handwritten letters about their flora and fauna. The other point I wanted to make about that story that I wrote back in 1971, it was a story called Exit to San Breda. It was set in the American Southwest, which is where I live today, but I'd never visited there at the time, so in fact, I'd seldom gone anywhere beyond Bayonne, New Jersey, where I grew up, and Chicago, where Northwestern was, until I came here to Washington for that brief period of time. It was a ghost story, although it was set in the future. It was set in a future where cars are no longer used and people are traveling by other means of transportation, but there's still a few people who collect cars and they travel on the highways. And the highways, which are decaying and not maintained anymore because no one uses cars, are haunted. I wanted to go at the ghost story, which seemed to me was always set in these Gothic haunted houses. What was the essence of a ghost? Where did you get ghosts? Well, you got ghosts in places where violent death had occurred, usually. So what would be more haunted than the highways, which were a great place of violent death in modern America in the 70s, certainly in the 60s, and so forth. And it seemed to me to be something else that no one had done. And it was not a terrific story, but an original enough idea that it did sell. And what's important about it is a ghost story. It was a ghost story. It was a fantasy. Because I do get a lot of questions these days about why, having written primarily science fiction in the early part of my career, why I turned to fantasy. And my answer to that is I never turned to fantasy. I wrote fantasy all along, as that second sale of mine testifies. My first sale was a science fiction story. My second was this ghost story. I would sell other fantasy stories in the 70s. I would sell other science fiction stories. I would also do hybrids, where I tried to mix and match the genres. This was a relic, really, of the things that I'd read growing up. I think any writer, ultimately, you write the stories you want to read, and the stories you write are also affected by the stories you read. And I grew up reading science fiction, fantasy, horror, comic books. My father, who read none of that stuff, called it all weird stuff, and he put it all in one bag. So I was a reader of weird stuff, and I think I still am. I like weird stuff and weird people. These days, the publishing industry has evolved so that there's very strong divisions between these genres. And we have fantasy writers who never write science fiction. We have science fiction writers who never write fantasy. That was certainly not true. I've moved between these genres pretty freely, and I grew up reading writers who did, people like Jack Vance and Poul Anderson, even Robert A. Heinlein, the great science fiction writer who in some ways defined modern science fiction, wrote his share of fantasy in stories like Magic Incorporated and a few others. The Unpleasant Profession of Jonathan Hoag, I would categorize as fantasy. I don't think that fantasy and science fiction are at all antithetical, as some people would have you believe. I think they're two flavors of the same thing. They're two flavors of weird stuff. The way they get their effects is perhaps different. The language of metaphor that they use is somewhat different. You have elves in one and aliens in another, but I don't think that they need to be two worlds at war or two divisions. So it was a fairly natural transition for me to mix and match them early in my career. And this series that I'm presently writing, A Song of Ice and Fire, which I began after leaving Hollywood. Was partly a reaction to Hollywood because I'd spent 10 years out in Hollywood, roughly from 1985 to 1995. My scripts were almost always too long and too expensive. So I would produce the first draft of my script that would be too long and too expensive, and then I would cut it. I would eliminate characters. I would combine characters. I would have a battle with a cast of thousands that would end up being a skirmish with 6 guys. I would have 17 matte paintings in the first draft and 2 in the shooting draft. My imagination was always too big for the page as it was contained at the time. And there were always too many pages. So I did this for a decade, which was the sort of the process of, bringing forth your baby and then going in with shears and cutting off fingers and arms and legs and just trying to get the baby to fit that little 46-minute time slot there. And after a decade of it, I was pretty sick of it. So I wanted to do something big. I wanted to do something where I could spread out, where I could have a cast of more than 6, where I could have as many matte paintings. Oh, I don't need matte paintings. I can just describe them and people will see them. And gigantic sets, gigantic battles to tell the story as big as I wanted to tell it. And that was one of the impulses that led me to do Ice and Fire. Of course, even I had no idea when I began this story quite how big it would become. Yet, yes, it is true that it was supposed to be initially a trilogy. And it kind of grew. Those of you know, there are 3 books out now. The 4th book will be out November 8th. That's the good news. The bad news is it's really only half the 4th book because the 4th book got so big that I had to essentially divide it in half. But I didn't divide it in half right down the middle. I divided it in half by pulling apart the character threads. So the book that you'll be reading in November concerns itself mainly with King's Landing and the contest for the Iron Throne and some of the characters around there. But the action that takes place on the Wall and the action that takes place on the other continent, which is largely taking place simultaneously, albeit thousands of miles away, will be in the next book, Dance with Dragons. And as a result of the division, I was able to get a 500-page head start for that. So I'm now 500 pages into the next book and still have another 500 to write. So after I get done with all of these tours, I will get back to that, honest, I swear it. they'll put my manacles and chains back on me and chain me back to the computer again. I'm now aiming to finish the entire thing in 7 volumes. Seven's a good number. It's 7 kingdoms, 7 gods. 7 is nice, but we'll see. But I do promise that there is an end. I mean, I've already been asked here, is this a never-ending series? No, I don't believe in never-ending series. I think a good story requires a beginning, a middle, maybe a lot of middle, and an end. I want to provide that for you. I have gotten the 10-minute signal, which means we have a few minutes now for questions from the audience, and then I will be done. Yes? 7 books, yes.
What will you be having your sights on after this?
Would be primary. I don't know. Probably something different. I mean, I do like to do different things. Maybe I'll write a science fiction book. Maybe I'll write a sequel to Fever Dream. Maybe I'll write a sequel to Tough Voyaging. Maybe I'll write a few years down the road, and I'll tackle that when I get to it.
Your initial comments about as a child you would read these stories for a nickel and act out all the parts. Just wanted to let you know I have a quarter here, and I was wondering, would you be willing to act out one of those little short stories for us?
I'm afraid I don't have the text. I had to read them. Those stories are lost in the mists of time. But
Well,
I do
then no-
appreciate the offer of the quarter. Yes.
Yes, your style is rather refreshing, and epic fantasy has become a much more popular genre lately. And I think one of the things that's very significant about A Song of Ice and Fire is that you don't preach heavy moralistic type stories, and you're not afraid to show the dark sides of characters, and you're not afraid to kill off your characters. Yes, as we've all seen, we all remember the wedding scene, but sorry. What I'm wondering is, have you met a lot of resistance with this sort of style that's a little darker than what you find in mainstream fantasy fiction, or has it been pretty easy to get by through that?
Well, I mean, the books have certainly been very popular. So there are many thousands of readers who do enjoy what I'm doing in terms of being darker and perhaps having more ambiguity, more layers. All of the things that I'm attempting to do in it. Are there some people who don't like that? Yes, certainly. I do see occasional reviews that are negative. I get occasional letters of people who want the more traditional type of fantasy where you have the good guys in the white cloaks and the bad guys in the black cloaks, and there's a dark lord who wants to extend his evil dominion over all of Earth, and gosh, all the elves and the dwarves have to get together to stop him. Sure. And that's fine if they like that. I mean, I'm by no means the only fantasy writer, so there's other people out there that they don't have to read me, they can read other people. And the people who want to read what I'm doing can read what I'm doing. So, yeah, but there is some negative. Fortunately, I don't, mostly the people who write me and come to these things are the people who like what I'm doing, so. The biggest criticism I get, I can add this, is actually not over any of those things, killing characters or moral ambiguity. The biggest complaint I get is about the sex, which is odd. I mean, I do get a steady stream of letters, pretty much outnumbered, of course, by the positive letters. I always want to stress that. These complaints are relatively few, but I get people who say, well, why do you put in all this gratuitous sex? And I don't consider any sex to be gratuitous. And I do find that this is an odd sign of our culture, that you can describe an axe entering a man's head and you won't get a peep of complaint, but describe a penis entering a vagina, and boy, boy, do people get upset. So, yes.
One of the things that I noticed you do really well in Song of Ice and Fire is the foreshadowing. There are things in book 3 that are foreshadowed as far back as book 2 and maybe even book 1. And I was wondering if you have difficulty balancing the foreshadowing with spontaneity as a writer. If you have these things that you've foreshadowed, then how do you balance that with spontaneity? Do you feel like you're straitjacketing yourself to a certain plot?
No, I don't find that foreshadowing things lessens the spontaneity. I could see why you think it might, but I don't know. For some reason, it doesn't. I don't have a formal outline. I'm not one of these writers who outlines what's going to be in every scene, what's going to be in every chapter. I might be faster if I did. I did have to do that in Hollywood. I had never done that before. When I got to Hollywood, I didn't want to do that, but they made me. I kept saying, just let me write the script, and then you'll see how it comes out. And no, I have to have the outline first. So I got used to outlining there, but I never liked it. It did take away some of the spontaneity. I felt, in some senses, I had already told the story, even though I'd only told it in shorthand. And retelling the story over again is not as much fun as telling the story for the first time. There was a wonderful novel that came out, a decade or more ago, called Replay by Ken Grimwood. Some of you may have read it. Science fiction novel. It's about a guy who wakes up one day. He's like a 45-year-old businessman. He has a heart attack. He dies. He suddenly wakes up. He's 17 years old. He's in his college dormitory. And he has his whole life to live over. It's 1968 again, or whatever it is. And it's the story of what happens to him as he lives that over. And when I read that book, I thought about myself and what would it be like for me if I suddenly was back at Northwestern? It was 1968, and I woke up and I'm a freshman in my dormitory. But I have all my memories, so I know what my life was like, and I know all the stories that I wrote. And it was actually a terrifying thought, because I said, well, wait a minute. I have to write Sand Kings again, It turned out pretty well the last time, but I don't remember exactly how it goes. I mean, what if I mess it up this time? And not only that, but that I have to write the bad stories again, the ones that nobody liked when they came out. Or can I just, skip over them? So outlining is almost a little bit like that. It's like, okay, you told the story once in outline. Now you have to tell it again with, words. And so I prefer not to do that.
Stephen King wrote this great book called On Writing, about the craft of writing. And the first scene, he describes him and Amy Tan sitting around a table talking about how no one ever asked them, these popular fiction authors, about the craft of writing. And I was wondering if you ever sweat that stuff. I mean, do you consider your sentences as much as, say, John Irving or Tom Wolfe would sit there and worry about stuff? Or do you find that it's the story that compels you and that drives you more than the language?
Yeah, I certainly consider my sentences. I don't know if I consider them as much as Tom Wolfe or John Irving, but I tell you, following those two guys is intimidating, and Neil Gaiman in the middle.
You. It's all good.
But those are two of the great writers of our time, three of the great writers of our time, with Neil in there. Particularly with the advent of computers, I think computers are a great adjunct to rewriting. I rewrite a lot more in these days. I'm constantly polishing my prose and trying to get the sentence there. Of course, I have a lot of sentences in my books, so admittedly, some of them get more more attention than others. But yeah, the craft of writing, is something that I consider and is something that I worry about. And it's one of the hardest things. I have the scenes in my head. I can see how the battle is going. And now I have to get it into your head, and I have to find the words to do that. And choosing those words, the right words that'll get the image across and make everything flow and be exciting and have a certain poetry itself, it's very difficult. Yes?
I was just wondering if how you keep all this stuff, all your plot lines and subplot lines do you keep them in your head? Do you have a notebook or several notebooks, obviously, with this stuff?
I keep them in my head. That's why I need such big hats. Yes, I have a few pages of notebooks, and I have a few notes that I keep things, but no formal outlines, and you'd be surprised at how relatively little there is. So most of it is just in my head, God help me, so I better not get hit by a bus. Yes?
I I was curious. You were saying you're going to finish off A Song of Ice and Fire, but you have those 2 short stories from Legends of Dunk, which is fantastic, taking 100 years before that. Will you also, after this, possibly want to continue those
yes.
because they're magnificent unto themselves as well?
Yeah, he's asking about the Dunk and Egg stories that have been in Legends. They're prequels to Ice and Fire. Yeah, my plan is to do one of those between each volume. So I'm working on the third one right now, and I hope to have it finished, within a month. And we'll see. But there's no Legends 3 coming up, unfortunately. So I have to figure out where I'm going to publish it once it's done. I have a couple possibilities, but there's no. But I will. I love Dunk and Egg. Eventually, I want to write like 9 or 10 stories about their lives, taking them all the way through, and publish those as a book or 2 or 3 books, whatever it was. Yes.
In the Song of Ice and Fire, your characters, at first, like, they can seem like as like typical good or bad. Then, as you get into the stories, you find that you find them yourself conflicting with who they really are, because there's some good in them and some bad in them. Is it sometimes hard, like with some of the characters, to make them like that with conflicting personalities, so you're not sure who to?
It's hard to create a fully fleshed character, certainly, but to my mind, human beings are really like that. I mean, I don't know anyone who's purely evil, and I don't know anyone who's purely good, and I suspect that most of you in the tent have things that are good about you and have weaknesses and flaws that, we all have heroes in us and we all have demons in us, and it comes out in our lives in different circumstances. I'm a vast admirer of J.R.R. Tolkien, don't get me wrong. Though I read those books in junior high school. Lord of the Rings had a tremendous impact on me, but I in some ways I think he set fantasy down an unfortunate path with this whole Dark Lord and forces of darkness and the orcs, the evil race. There's no good orcs. There's no even orcs who are sort of like the others, who have a moment of kindness, and that's fine for orcs, I guess, but I hate to see it become the template for fantasy, because I want to write about people, and that even if they're elves or dwarves, or Chris Morph is not a dwarf like his, but he's certainly a very complex and conflicted character. We're out of time, but thank you all for coming, and I will be signing down at the signing tent.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.